Okay, welcome everybody to Psychedelic Safety Seminar number 10. So this one we're looking at the role of media in the psychedelic ecosystem and how the role it's played in the Renaissance. And we've got a panel of three excellent speakers and very experienced reporters and a special guest as well. So our panel is Josh Hardman, who's the founder and the editor of Psychedelic Alpha. We've got Shayla Love, who has written on psychedelics for Vice, for The Atlantic, and has written also for The New Yorker and other publications. And we've got Matta Busby, who's written on psychedelics for also Vice, Rolling Stone, and others. And then we also have Jack Gorslein, who's going to be speaking a little later briefly about the Psychedelic Writers Guild, which Jack's setting up. So the structure is going to be, I'm going to ask them questions for about 40 minutes. If questions occur to you during that time, you can put them into the chat, and I will feed those questions to them for the final 30 minutes. So we're looking to do about an 80-minute event. So maybe we could start off by just asking the three panelists, how, when, and why did you start writing about psychedelics? Um, Josh, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, George. Thanks for hosting this as well. It's great to see. I love that everyone's got cameras on as well, like a lot of people. It's way more interactive than that Zoom webinar format where you can't see how many people you're speaking to, any of their names. So it's great to see you all. Thanks for coming. Yeah, how did I get interested in writing about psychedelics? I think it was coming up to 5 years ago now. I'd kind of been following the psychedelics research field, I guess, since I studied in California. I did 1 year at UC Berkeley as kind of my year abroad. I was studying at LSE doing economics and politics and all this boring stuff. And then I went to California and was exposed to psychedelics through indigenous studies, but also through studying the counterculture. So that was kind of my in. And that was when Trump just got elected. So that would have been 2017, 2018. And then I was kind of like following things along. And I became aware of these companies that were trying to develop psychedelics in a more kind of like traditional pharmaceutical way. And to me, my kind of first reaction was like, there's no way that's going to work, right? You can't take psychedelics outside of these, I guess, community contexts and put them under the cold fluorescent light of the laboratory, right? Like that just won't work. So that's what got me interested and ultimately why I started the website to try and like keep tabs on these companies. And back then there was probably a handful of them. At its peak, there were hundreds. I think now there's probably a couple of hundred companies looking in some way at developing psychedelics into medicine. So yeah, and it started just as a one-page WordPress blog listing the companies, and then over time, it's added resources on tracking patents and drug development, and regularly writing content. And I guess the one disclaimer is Matta and Shayla and Jules are all accomplished journalists. I'm more of a, I guess, an analyst and sometimes derisively called a blogger, I think, or a keyboard warrior. But yeah, I don't have any traditional journalism training. And I don't profess to be a journalist. Maybe I'll aspire to be one day. But yeah,
That's interesting. Thanks, Josh. And just when did you start Psychedelic Alpha?
yeah. So March 2020. So
Okay,
yeah, coming up to 5 years ago.
brilliant. Shayla, how about you? When did you, when, why, and how did you start writing about psychedelics?
Yeah, so I did the more classic journalism training and was working in New York as first a kind of hyper local journalist for local newspapers and online websites. I switched to science journalism and went to grad school for that. And when I left Columbia, where I did my science journalism degree, I knew I wanted to focus on neuroscience, mental health, psychology, but also kind of how culture interacts with the definitions of mental health and how, there are these like looping effects between ideas about psychology and the way people experience psychology. And I started at Vice in 2017, which was a year before Michael Pollan's book came out. And I was kind of a weird Vice reporter because when I joined, I was like probably the nerdiest sciencey person that was there on my desk. But they were really interested in me writing about psychedelics, and I was interested in it too, from not just the experiential sort of like spiritual community side, but really from the sciencey psychology, social sciences side. And so that's what I started doing, and that coincided with writing a lot, kind of counterintuitively, about patents and the business side of psychedelics, because I was interested in how psychedelics were going to integrate into systems that already existed in our societies, like the patent system or the biotech world. And that's how I met Josh initially, too, because we were thinking about patents and the business side of psychedelics very, very early on, I think, when people still thought it was not going to be possible. So since then, I write about many other topics within science and health, but psychedelics has a very special interest to me, and I think it's like only growing in relevance and sort of mainstreaming. So I'll continue to have it be a big part of my beats wherever I go.
Hmm. Awesome. And how about you, Matter?
Hi, yeah, thanks for organizing and thanks to everyone for coming as well. I've been awful at this in the past, so I will have to correct the pronunciation of my name. It's Mayfair, but it's like a Scottish word, so actually it's, you know, not pronounced as it's spelt.
Yeah, okay.
But
Sorry.
yeah,
There we
thank you
go.
so much.
I've known you for about a year, but I guess it's been more WhatsApp chat. So,
Yeah, it's been a journey. It's been a
yeah.
journey. Yeah, I mean, I've got an answer freshly made because Henry at the Tricycle Day newsletter asked me this the other day, and yeah, I'm wondering like, yeah, how the story necessarily looks, but whatever. I mean, I was basically traveling in the Amazon like 10, 11 years ago, and a friend, said, do you want to do it? And I was kind of like, yeah. And 2 hours later, I was like, wait, what were you talking about earlier? And she was like, ayahuasca. And so, a few weeks later, we ended up like a 4 hour boat ride from Iquitos, the jungle city, doing a ceremony with an indigenous medicine lady. And yeah, my experience wasn't super intense, but hers was, and she communed with her late mother. And yeah, then kind of getting back to London a year or two later, like all around, people were taking kind of less cocaine at parties and more like 2CB and mushroom drops. And so the kind of culture, the psychedelic renaissance, the cultural shift, I kind of felt was happening around me. And even at times I felt actually like a sort of participant in that shift. Stopping drinking, changing hobbies, different listening to different types of music, all of that. And yeah, I mean, I also like Shayla went through like traditional routes. I did student journalism and then I did a master's back in London. And yeah, I was working mostly for The Guardian, also for Vice. And I think it was late 2017. I was discussing some ideas with the editor there, Jamie, and he didn't like one of my ideas on psychedelics, but he had this story that he wanted someone to do on how people can take LSD and feel like they're communicating with nature. So I ended up writing that for him, and then some months later was a particularly late mushroom fruiting season in England that a few friends had told me about. So I ended up writing about that as well for The Guardian, and it turned out to be a super viral story. Like all the other papers picked it up almost verbatim occasionally, I should say. And yeah, from there, I realized it's super interesting area, and at times, I probably had some unique insights into it, at least in terms of the sort of people in the mainstream media.
Yeah. I don't know to what extent you three have experience of writing on other beats, or what your sense is of, are there any kind of peculiarities or differences about reporting on psychedelics, psychedelic culture, psychedelic industry compared to other bits of the world or other industries? I mean, I had some experience like being a business journalist before being a kind of psychedelic journalist. But not that I'm a journalist, but what about you? What are the peculiarities of it? Is it just like other kinds of journalism, or there are some things that are a little different? And whoever wants to go first, go first. Otherwise, I'll nominate someone. You can just stick up a hand or yeah, Mate.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I think like ultimately what stakes this field out as different is most like a lot of the people involved in the industry or the underground or what have you are mostly regularly taking mind altering drugs, right? So it's kind of infused with this with this very fact. And I think in some cases that does lead people to be a bit ungrounded, but in other cases it's immensely healing. But people are on that journey together. So yeah, it just leads to all sorts of peculiar kind of interpersonal scenarios. Like,
Yeah.
I never really, when I'm reporting other stories, just end up hearing about, all these random bits about people's lives. Whereas, the people involved in psychedelics are kind of, I don't know, there's more emotional openness, maybe even more trust in a stranger to some degree. So I think that's, really, really interesting. And
Mm.
yeah, I find a lot of value in that because, in other fields it can be a little bit like, yeah, yeah, just not super friendly, but then it can go a bit too far the other way as well, the psychedelic folks, and they want to talk to you all day. Yeah, that's my take.
Shayla, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's sort of similar, one area that's similar is when I worked at Vice, I was on the motherboard, which was the tech desk. And at the Atlantic now, I find that in with my colleagues who report on the tech industry, we have a lot of similarities in reporting on psychedelics and the tech world, which of course now there's a big overlap between the tech world and the psychedelics world. Those things are coming together. But the things that I think are in common are people who really believe that they are ushering in some kind of new technology that they have a lot of faith in, whether that be psilocybin or AI, or a new like social media platform. And there is a sort of tight-knit community that has a lot of drama and characters in both of them, and the idea that you're doing something that sort of disrupts the status quo. And so I think my coworkers and friends who report on tech, they are the people who I've seen the most similarity with in writing about psychedelics.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a similarity with something like crypto, where there's like somewhat faith-based. Like if you talk it down, then it might be less likely to happen. So don't talk it down. So it's like, if you clap, a fairy will die or something. But Josh,
Yeah.
yeah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, don't talk about the guy having a mushroom trip and chopping off his own penis because that will dissuade people from taking mushrooms.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's a bit the same in crypto. But Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I don't have any experience reporting on other fields, obviously, but I think in the stuff that I cover, like the research and drug development side, more than other stuff, and I guess some policy reform stuff. But I think one of the key themes is, yeah, this like caginess. And I have the benefit of I'm writing effectively a newsletter for people in the field or people in tangential fields that are very interested in psychedelics. I don't really have many people Googling about psychedelics or reading The Guardian and being exposed to it for the first time. So I'm kind of talking to insiders already, which I see as a benefit, right? Because I can go deeper into the weeds. I can talk about some of the thornier issues without worrying about, playing into the war on drugs or, repeating what happened in the 60s and 70s. But even some of my readers contact me and they're like, it makes me really uneasy that you're writing so much about all these negative things that are happening, like with FDA's review of MDMA. Because, we've been here before, like, and, almost expecting me to take on this responsibility to not rock the boat and to not, I guess, as you're saying, Matha, to not talk about the guy who chopped off his penis, right? Which is strange. I mean, because to me, I'm just like, well, I'll write what I see, right? And like as it happens. But yeah, there seems to be this caginess, which I guess is, partly the fact that we're dealing with illegal substances and also just how, there are some people in this space that experienced everything get derailed the first time, right? 50, 60 years ago. So I sympathize with it. But it makes our jobs quite hard, I think, because we're kind of trying to like balance all of these different competing concerns. But yeah.
Obviously, we are writing about a culture, and sometimes people call it a movement, in which some people have worked for decades to try and bring these substances that are illegal into legality in different forms. So, like decades and decades, like, you think of Rick Doblin, I mean, like 40 years plus. So, I mean, that I suppose affects one's reporting on it. And something I've sometimes heard is like a feeling that journalists are not being advocates or could be more advocates for like the cause, for the movement. And of course, some journalists are quite like that. If you take journalists broadly, refined, like broadly defined, like Joe Rogan is quite, you're not going to hear many Joe Rogan episodes on the harms of psychedelics, or like Hamilton Morris, or even arguably someone like, Michael Pollan, if you consider his like Netflix series. I mean, it ends with psychedelics can change the world for the better. So to what extent do you think journalists in the space should be, advocates for psychedelics?
I can start. I mean, again, I have worked as a very sort of traditional journalist for my whole career, and the idea is that we are reporting from an unbiased perspective. That means, on the strictest level, that we don't take gifts, we don't accept speaking fees, we don't, we're not supposed to be swayed in one way or another. We're reporting on issues that come up within a field or topic. And I do agree with that to a certain extent. I think that if you know, if a source knows that you are an advocate for something, there you may not be exposed to certain issues or stories or people who disagree with you or know that you disagree with them. And so I think being neutral as a journalist is really important. That said, I think at Vice, something that I liked and I continue to hold now is that the way that I report on psychedelics has this baseline assumption that they could be helpful for mental health in some way. And that is a position, right? I'm not writing articles like should are these substances valuable at all? It's like when they are applied in this setting, what happens next? And so I think there's like multiple ways to be an advocate. One is just taking psychedelics seriously in the way that they're being used and the way that they could be used. But then there's a different thing in terms of really advocating for like approval. I think it's a journalist's job to report on other people advocating for approval.
Yeah. Josh, I saw in your annual letter, you said that you mentioned this a bit. You said that, look, I sometimes discuss kind of critical things, but this is inside baseball. This is within the community. Externally, I do try and like speak up for psychedelics. So, do you feel this as an issue? Do you feel kind of sometimes, or has this come up in your work and in the feedback you've got?
Yeah, I think that's the benefit of not being a traditionally defined journalist, right? I can take more positions on things, and yeah, I also just think that, you know, being an advocate for psychedelics is also, being an advocate for, you know, looking at other mental health treatments, right? Like revisiting the drawing board on mental health treatments, thinking about funding. I also think like we just need more funding of psychedelic studies from less biased sources, right? Like I think that would help a lot in bringing people along with advocates. But yeah, I guess as a consumer of journalism, yeah, I do expect true journalists to uphold the values that Shayla's describing. And I also think that, you know, as we mentioned earlier, psychedelics, belief in psychedelics can come down to, something that resembles faith. But I also think, a lot of people say that psychedelic experiences create an almost childlike curiosity, whilst you're on a drug like LSD. And I think that, even if I'm not a true journalist, I think, curiosity is kind of a nice, not necessarily neutral, but a nice like driving force for me, right? Like I'm always coming into, learning things that I don't understand, and I have to be curious, right? And try to get to the bottom of it and separate what's fact from fiction. So I think that's what drives me. But yeah, I have been concerned, I guess, around the like whole FDA MDMA situation, with some journalists like writing stories in popular media, kind of criticizing the whole process. And those journalists do have strong ties to a lot of the actors involved. They have had their own life-changing MDMA experiences that they've written extensively about. And I think, maybe that doesn't bother me so much, but I think a member of the public, if they knew all that, they might not take that journalism as seriously, and they might, even question the journalistic integrity. So I do think it is important for, and that's why I'm so keen to say I'm not a journalist, because I just think it's so important to like have journalists do it that way, right?
There's just, I suppose there's also different forms. I mean, it's quite common for documentary makers to make a documentary and it's more of a kind of an argument, like a long essay about
Mm.
something like And it's also a bit like that with non-fiction books. They usually have, one argument that they're trying to pitch, as opposed to like a news article or something.
Yeah. And I also think now we have, the whole like Substackification, right? Like we have so many different competing viewpoints and so many platforms for people to share their views.
Mm.
That's why I think that like clearly defining journalism and like having journalists write about psychedelics in an unbiased way is so important because there's so many people like me with a soapbox, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a low barrier to entry, right, for people like me. So yeah.
Matt, do you think that the vibe on psychedelics in media, including social media, has become more critical or more negative in the last kind of couple of years? And is there a risk of it becoming, and same question to all the panelists, too negative? I mean, I think this is the big concern that it could turn into like, well, what happened in the 60s when you had like Time Life magazine going from leading advocate to kind of LSD panic within a few years. So Mather, what do you think? Do you think it has got more critical, and could it become overly critical and even kind of, you know, panicky or doom mongering?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably, I mean, it's a unique case. It is a singular case, but I mean, I think you could compare it to kind of other sort of alternative things or fringe movements. They get demonized, then they sort of get co-signed by, a few sort of cultural gatekeepers, have a moment for a while, then some of the gatekeepers, get taken down, and then there's some other thing, and then it's all good again. This is how, newspapers and magazines, get sold. There's obviously like a symbiotic relationship between them and news slash stories, right? And you can't just keep telling the same story over and over again. Um,
And you feel
I
like,
think
for
right.
example, yeah, I saw you say in your interview with Tricycle that there's been a certain kind of story that's been told a lot of, like, for example, like veterans going to the jungle to get healing. And do you, Shayla, sense a kind of editor fatigue around certain kinds of psychedelic stories?
Well, I do think you can't just like pitch a story anymore about someone taking psychedelics and having symptoms of a mental health condition improve. Like that alone is not novel enough to get a story commissioned most of the time anymore. And I think that's okay. I don't think that means it's turning only towards negative stories. I think that that's just not news anymore. And in some ways, that's a success of the mainstreaming of psychedelic medicine, right? Because people are kind of like, yeah, we know that's happening and we know the research is happening. If there's been a turn in media coverage, I think the articles are just getting more nuanced. And I think that they are about sometimes people misbehaving and doing bad things in settings where vulnerable people go and seek out help. Matha does really good work on stories like that. That doesn't mean that they're like the media coverage is turning. I think there was really good media coverage about the FDA decision too, actually. People were confused about it, especially lay people who don't follow this stuff very closely, like what happened there and like they wanted to know and this is the point in which like the simplistic stories sort of aren't enough to answer the question like how are psychedelics going to be integrated into medicine or our legal systems anymore. The answers are getting more complicated, and so because of that the articles like don't just come across as shiny, but I don't think it's because they're overwhelmingly negative.
Right, right. That
Yeah,
makes
I think it's all part of like a bigger kind of macro process of like the acculturation, the mainstreaming of psychedelics. I mean, Diplo was saying that he was like macrodosing on LSD the other day on New Year's Eve with bloody Anderson Cooper, and Anderson Cooper was just giggling along. I mean, he almost had a coughing fit, and it's completely implausible that that sort of thing would happen 20 years ago, right? Like they clearly cooked it up with the producers. Oh, what should we talk about? He was like, oh, I'm on LSD. Oh, great, let's talk about that. Like it's interesting how it's gone. But I think that the whole war on drugs is just on such ridiculous premises and just always, the objectives unachievable. So now it is kind of inevitable that the sort of mainstream institutions and people do just kind of have to accept and just find a way to kind of shoehorn psychedelics in because frankly so many people are taking them.
Thank you guys. What's the psychedelic story that has caused you the most stress or controversy? And what sort of pushback have you experienced from psychedelic culture and industry if you've ever written something somewhat critical? Josh, you go first.
Yeah. Also, just on the last thing, I was going to say
Yeah.
outside of mainstream journalism, within the kind of psychedelic industry or field, there were a bunch of media outlets that cropped up in like I guess right when I was cropping up in like 2020, 2021. And all they did was publish positive articles about psychedelic business and research. There was one called Psychedelic Finance. I think it still kind of exists as a website, but it was just like a PR machine, and the companies would pay them, 30 grand a month to publish, fluff pieces. There was another one which is kind of still around, Microdose, and they ran Wonderland, a big conference in Miami. I think they raised $1 million. And again, they were very positive, right? And publishing all these positive stories about the industry. So I think by virtue of them kind of fizzling out to some extent and going away because the funding dried up, stuff does seem less positive. Whether that means there's more negative coverage within the industry, I don't know. But I think that's like an important thing. Like a lot of those megaphones and like industry cheerleaders have kind of moved on to the next thing, whether that's, crypto or longevity. So I think that's like a big element of it as well within the field.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, in terms of like stories that got me in hot water, well, I think actually the most interesting thing was when I was writing about, the ISA review, the cost effectiveness review of MDMA, and that kind of foreshadowed what happened with the FDA's advisory committee. It was very negative. It went beyond what ISA usually does, which is to focus on the health economics of a new intervention coming to market in the US. And it went further and it kind of criticized how the studies were run and the methodology, and publicized further cases of misconduct in the trials. And yeah, so I was writing about that as soon as the report dropped, and I got more pushback from people within the psychedelic field for writing about that than any other story by far. I received, dozens of emails straight away. I had people wanting calls with me, and I hadn't written it in a kind of like editorial way at all. It was kind of just like a very boring, dry breakdown of this boring, dry report.
Mm.
But yeah, I got loads of messages saying, you're naive, you don't understand what ISA does, like you shouldn't be publishing this. Well, no, not you shouldn't be publishing this, just saying that I've kind of taken the bait in
Yeah.
publishing it. So yeah, that was, really surprising to me that
Yeah.
that which I thought was quite a boring summary story got the
Yeah.
most kind of backlash. And to be honest, a lot of the people that messaged me about it, none of them worked for Lycos, which was funny, and none of them were really in the Lycos orbit. But yeah, it was other people in the psychedelic drug development world, in the kind of non-profit world. They were all pretty pissed off, to be honest. So yeah.
Mm. What about you, Shayla?
Well, the thing that still follows me is also something that I and my editor thought was going to be very boring
Mm.
at the outset, which was Compass Pathways polymorph patents.
Mhm.
Um, which, the reason that we were interested in this story, and I've said this before, is that Compass was already known for transitioning from nonprofit to for-profit. And there were people in the psychedelic community who were part of other nonprofits who felt a little burned by that decision that they made. Olivia Goldhill wrote a great piece about that, about their move from nonprofit to for-profit. And when we saw their patents, we sort of felt like they were leading the way in what a traditional like pharma approach to psychedelics could be, right? Like they were the first really big for-profit company, and then they had these patents that, we assumed it was only going to be a matter of time before there were tons of for-profit psychedelic companies that had patents, which is the case now if you look around at the ecosystem. But Compass was really the first one to kind of lead the way and show what's possible if you do psychedelics in this other way. And so I covered like the early days of psychedelic patents in biotech quite a lot because we felt like this was ushering in this new phase of what psychedelic research in biotech would look like. Josh played a big part in that because the patent tracker was super helpful in my reporting on that. Um, and the challenge against Compass's patents was also very important news because it was the first time that we could see exactly how this would play out if someone tried to challenge one of these patents on a psilocybin polymorph, which is the same molecule, just a different crystal structure. And that would certainly set a precedent for any other polymorph patents potentially that came down the line. Since then, even though I haven't written about that topic in a very, very long time, I am still accused of somehow like conflicts of interest. about that topic when I look around at the psychedelic for-profit ecosystem. It is exactly what we foretold with the Compass story.
Mm.
There's tons of for-profit companies, and to file a patent now is certainly not news the way it was in like 2021, 2022 when we were writing that stuff. Yeah.
But I suppose that was one of these very controversial moments when the field, which thought it was heading in one direction, took a left turn. And you kind of reported on that, and then maybe were maybe criticized for causing or partly causing that different turn, or I don't know.
Maybe. I mean, I think it certainly would have gone that way anyway. I guess
Yeah.
we'll never really know. I think the criticism was like and has been similar to what Josh said about like how could you be so naive, right? Like of course these companies need to file patents because how else are they going to generate research dollars, and you're getting in the way of legalization of medical psychedelics in some way by being anti-patent. And that was never really the substance of those pieces. It was more like this is different for psychedelics to suddenly be about, like a return on investment to investors who are investing in these patents and these sort of like monopolies. And we've never seen that in this industry before. And what will the consequences be down the line? I think that those are still like really pressing questions, even though now we don't really blink at psychedelic patents anymore, just a few years later.
Mather, you and I have both reported on sometimes misconduct by indigenous shamans or non-Western organizations or individuals. Have you received ever criticism for that? For, a Westerner like criticizing the conduct of a non-Westerner in some way or of an indigenous person? I mean, what are the kind of complexities and sensitivities around that kind of reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly never, received on anything actually like a sort of torrent of pushback as Josh was kind of describing, like dozens of emails. I mean, there's been a few bits and pieces here and there. I remember one story did need a little correction just due to the framing that came up in the editing process, I should add. And then there was the mushroom penis story the other day, which there was a lot of comments on Instagram, but none really at me. And then there was the Wired story on mushrooms getting stronger, and a couple of people really did like reach out in quite some detail, kind of saying that I was putting like mushrooms in this sort of negative veneer by kind of suggesting that it wasn't entirely positive that people are kind of manufacturing them to get stronger. Although I certainly did spell out the benefits. I think it was a perfectly balanced piece. But there you go. I mean, on the topic of your question, yeah, never anything like super significant. You kind of get people just sort of sending like a couple of people just sending you a couple of things, but not actually really engaging with any of the substance. It's more just about the vibes. You know what I mean? It's like the vibe that this story is putting off isn't kind of conducive to what we're trying to do here, man.
Mm.
So, it remains to be seen. I'm working on a couple of things at the moment that might inspire some sort of avalanche. I mean, if it does, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't.
Okay.
Can
Um,
I just, George, can I just
yeah.
add that I think the other thing is, I read everything Shayla and Matha put out because I'm a fanboy. But I'm guessing a lot of the people that read YouTube's articles are just, coming across them, I don't know how, I guess in their news feeds and on the Atlantic website or on the Vice website. Whereas with me, I'm emailing them out directly to kind of a community of peers in some ways. So I expect to get a lot more feedback. And even with the ISA story, I kind of live for the feedback, right? Even if it's negative, like that's helpful to me. It's good to know what other people are thinking. And then
Yeah.
in a lot of cases, I got on the phone with those people and worked their feedback into the next week's bulletin or story, which was, how the psychedelic industry is reacting to it. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm sulking about it. I mean, it is good and helpful in the same way. It was just
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. 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 Okay, so let's consider the kind of the big controversy of last year with Lycos. How was the Lycos War for you? Were you sucked into it? Did you get wounded in the Great Lycos War? Shayla, were you sucked into it, or did you manage to kind of keep some distance?
Yeah, I mean, the weird, sort of a weird thing for me right now is that I am on staff at The Atlantic right now, but the way the coverage goes there, it's really not beat reporting in the way I was doing at Vice on psychedelics, where I'm writing, I wrote two stories on psychedelics last year. I only started in September. So over the course of a couple months, I certainly anticipate to write more, but I'm not doing sort of news fast reactions. So I didn't really get sucked in the sense that I was watching very closely and very interested, but didn't have to cover it as a journalist so much, which was sort of, there's pros and cons to that. I probably would have liked to, but it was sort of nice to just watch it unfold. And I think there's still questions. But I mean, in the sense that I got sucked in, I certainly saw people that I know have really strong reactions on both sides and have to kind of deal with each other and try to process the decision in real time. And that's been very interesting to watch in conferences and also just in personal conversations, people trying to understand exactly what happened and what they feel about it.
Josh, you covered it probably I think closer than any other journalist. Were you surprised how acrimonious it got? And also, of course, we're now in like you know, Lycos 3, Return of the Doblin. I don't know what to call it, but there's a new chapter. And what do you think might happen? So there's two questions. Like, were you
Yeah.
surprised how acrimonious it got, and what do you think might happen with Lycos?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I lived and breathed Lycos for the whole of last summer, and my girlfriend, who knows nothing about this industry or psychedelics, she could name everyone involved as well. So, yeah, it was my life. I think I wrote maybe even 100,000 words on it all in. And I did live coverage of some of the committees for the first time as well. So yeah, it was tiring. There was no shortage of things to write about. And yeah, I guess I wasn't surprised. I mean, in hindsight, I'm not surprised how acrimonious it got. But yeah, I guess at the time I was like, I think you know, the group symposia, which people have very strong feelings about. I think a lot of people who had funded or been vocally advocates of, Lycos and MDMA and MAPS really saw them as the scapegoat. And I think things got like really nasty there. So I think that was, surprising and scary to see, nonprofits and leaders of nonprofits who were, supposedly meant to stop trauma and help people heal from mental health issues were then, singling out individuals and putting them at harm. I think, that was really depressing and, sad. But yeah, in terms of the future, I think this whole thing at the moment with Antonio Gracias is interesting, right? He's a friend of Elon Musk, like one of his staunchest supporters. Sergey Brin was sitting behind Barron Trump at the inauguration yesterday, and Sergey, the co-founder of Google, has invested in an ibogaine company. It's rumored that Nolan Williams, one of the biggest ibogaine researchers, is going to get a position in Trump's administration. Sergey's also a Burning Man celebrant. So yeah, I think there's all these people in the new Trump administration that a lot of people close to Lycos are hoping will kind of fast track an approval. So Genevieve Jurvetson was on stage at a conference in Berlin last week, and she said that her goal for this year, for 2025, is to get MDMA approved by the end of the year. So there's no shortage of people close
Right.
to the company that think that they can do this and that they can rush this through. But there's also no shortage of skeptics who are saying, that's very unlikely. And also, I think, you know, there's a lot of kind of measured, level-headed people who are saying, even if this did get rushed through by the end of 2025, that's no way to kind of bring along other stakeholders with you, right? Like psychiatrists and doctors, they're not going to suddenly go, oh, okay, I guess it's fine. They're going to have all the concerns that the FDA advisory committee had and that ISA had. So, yeah,
I mean,
whether
we could have
whether that would be a good strategy is, yeah.
who would have Trump, special approving executive order for MDMA on their bingo card. Would
Mm.
that
Yeah,
be
and I don't know how realistic it is. I mean, if you look at the whitehouse.gov website, there's nothing in Trump's priorities about health. And if you look at the cabinet page under the RFK Jr. bio, his whole bio is about his environmental advocacy. There's nothing about health. So, how this whole make America healthy again thing actually plays out is yet to be seen. So,
yeah,
yeah, and that's another area that I've been writing about a lot, like how much we should actually expect is going to happen. And I guess the next bit of investigation is would this be good? Like, do people think that it would be good if Trump just forced something through? Or it wouldn't be Trump, it would be the incoming commissioner of the FDA. But yeah.
right. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. May that once I sometimes hear about kind of stories that don't break, stories of misconduct, sometimes high level, and you think, oh, this will come out eventually, but it never does. I mean, is that your experience and other panelists' experience that there are sometimes these stories that people inside psychedelic culture know about, either of kind of tragedies or misconduct or something like that, and they just never come out. Is that your experience, Mather, and the other panelists? And if so, why is that? I mean, is there still a bit of a culture of secrecy? Anyway, these are all leading questions. Has that been your experience?
Um, Not overwhelmingly. I mean, one story comes to mind about an Ibogaine clinic that another journalist was working on, and there was some victims, alleged victims of some sort of sexual misconduct, and the clinic, when they got reached out to for comment, they filed a lawsuit against the publication, and that ultimately ended up with the story getting spiked. I mean, I've had that happen to me on other occasions, not regarding psychedelics. I remember I was doing a story on fox hunting, that turned out to be completely true and proven in court, but they took out a sort of, I don't know if it's a lawsuit or an injunction, a gagging order, and yeah, the publication I was writing it for, um, yeah, decided to bow to the pressure. So I mean, yeah, that I think it's par for the course in journalism. That
Yeah.
kind of stuff happens. I mean, I do get a sense as well. I mean, this is similar in political journalism. You've got a press pack, and a lot of them do know about certain things,
Hmm.
even big stories, but they don't get reported for various reasons. I mean, sometimes people don't want to be the first to kind of upset the apple cart, or they're waiting for a more significant like peg, to so the story breaks a bit more like organically or in a certain way. I mean, there's always like competing interests as well there. I mean, people had been talking a lot about Roland Griffiths, like concerns about Roland Griffiths, and what he was doing. I really haven't looked into it enough myself to take a view. Clearly, in many ways, he's a pioneer. But many people were kind of talking about some of those concerns, but the story didn't end up coming out until after he'd passed away. So maybe that was out of some sort of respect to him, and I imagine maybe there's other similar such things. I mean, in much the same way that the story of Americans might not be aware of this, but the story about like the COVID parties in Downing Street, where the UK government's based during the lockdown. I mean, all the journalists knew about that, but no one really wanted to break cover. And I'm sure everywhere where journalists congregate, there's going to be similar things, really.
Yeah. Okay. Any other panelists want to add anything on that? No? Okay. Let's talk just we're going to wrap up this bit now and take a go to questions soon. But let's talk a little bit about business models and just the changing landscape of journalism, which is obviously changing very quickly with newspapers laying off staff, people migrating from traditional print to alternative media, as a kind of Substack, the rise of like long form alternative podcasts and to massive influence. So, I mean, I suppose I have a quick question. Like, when everyone is creating content, is it getting harder to make a living as a professional journalist? And how do you find the kind of the business side of things in terms of reporting on psychedelia? Are there enough publications? Um, yeah. So what's your experience of that? Just partly generally as a journalist, but also as a psychedelic kind of, beat journalist. Anyone like to take that?
I can start. I mean, coming from the, again, more traditional journalism side, it's tough. Many of my friends who are journalists or trying to be journalists, they have, like, almost everyone's been laid off at least once. There's very few staff jobs out there. The good commissions are you can get them, but then you don't get paid until after the story is done usually, and the pay is pretty bad to do the kind of work that really takes many conversations and investigations, not to mention travel. It's really challenging, and there's a reason why so many news articles about psychedelics can feel sort of fast or rushed, or that's certainly been the case in the past, because journalists have to write like 5 articles a week if they're lucky, maybe, the minimum that you can write as a staffer is probably like 1 or 2 stories a week in most publications. So I think the business side of journalism is really hard, and as a result, there's all of these alternatives, which I like a lot of them, the podcast world, the Substack world. But there is a difference. There's a difference between someone who's being edited and not being edited, right? You can sort of slowly edge towards a kind of like myopic worldview inside an insular community where there's no one else sort of putting their hands on a product. And so I think it's just like it's harder for consumers actually, not just like the living wages of journalists, but for consumers to really understand the difference between what they're hearing or listening to or reading.
There's different kinds of potential biases. There's the
Yeah.
bias of a newsroom and a particular institution, but then there's individual bias when you're liberated from those structures. You can just go off on your own weird hobby horse or just not have checks. Like, are you sure? Have you tested this? Have you fact checked it? And so on.
I mean that's the sort of what you're on, really, isn't it, Jules? I mean, who edits you?
Yeah, no, it's a Substack. So occasionally if it's a very spicy story, I'll send it to a lawyer to check.
Yeah.
I have to, for legal insurance. But yeah, and sometimes it's terrifying as well. You print on a story and you think this is a controversial story, like I hope I got everything right and so on. So and you're not in a newsroom, which is its own kind of, solidarity and support.
Yeah, you are kind of protected. I mean, Carol Cadwallader, who did broke the Cambridge Analytica story at the Observer, it was only when she mentioned some of her reporting in a speech or a talk that then Aaron Banks's lot sued her.
Mm.
So yeah, having a publication behind you really does provide that sort of security. I mean, I was pretty much full time, kind of here like for a while at the Guardian, but always freelance. I've never had a staff job. I mean, one came up recently, but it was just going to be a lot of churn. And yeah, I'm fortunate enough that I've sort of managed to somewhat establish myself in this kind of niche, as well as doing kind of wider health stuff and subcultures. But it's been a hustle. It's really tough. You just got to work hard. I mean, it's a kind of young man or woman's
Mm.
game, really. I mean, perhaps it always has been, but yeah, you definitely get that sense that it's a kind of shrinking industry. But at the same time, I think there's different people popping up here and there, and one can always be surprised actually at sort of random people that seem to have some sort of philanthropic funding for these websites. I mean, then it's just about getting enough eyeballs on it. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of challenges.
Okay, we're going to go to questions, but first I'd like to bring in our special guest, Jack Gorslein, who reports on psychedelics, particularly from Boston. Welcome, Jack, and thank you for your reporting on some of the things like the Massachusetts psychedelics bill. So tell us about this new initiative you have of the Psychedelic Writers Guild. What's that, and what's the idea behind it?
Yeah, so first of all, it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Jules, for inviting me. Jules and Josh both have been, early champions of some of my work here on the ground in Massachusetts. And, my experience and kind of my long, strange journey to this point is part of, what kind of built the idea to start a guild. So to give a little bit of a brief backstory, it's a long story. I'll make it very short. I got my start about 16 months ago working, writing for the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, and kind of stumbled into the psychedelic beat because while I was familiar with the culture, I've had some experiences myself, really was kind of, the particular strain of ADHD, if you will, that like I've known I wanted to be a journalist since I was 12 years old. I was reviewing public Republican primary polling data from Nevada when I was 12 years old in the Nevada election. Um, And, but the opportunity to report on some frontlines coverage of activism here in Massachusetts presented itself and kind of fell into my lap. And the first article that I ever got paid to write was, troping through the woods at the Arnold Arboretum here in Boston, uh, you know, covering a grassroots foraging, event, for an organization that very slowly, to make a long story short, I uncovered a series of, bad faith behavior and misconduct of one activist in particular who, from the looks of mainstream media coverage from basically the 5 years prior, you would think that this was the preeminent, leader of the grassroots community here in Massachusetts that had, a lot of success drumming up support, 7 bills filed back in 2023, a lot of media coverage of, a number of different local decriminalization, deprioritization successes. But what I came to find, is that this was, this activist bad faith behavior was kind of the worst kept secret, in the psychedelic advocacy community here in New England, for the better part of the last half decade, including uncovering, this individual was impersonating, a U.S. Marine veteran for, almost a year, which Jules and Josh both were, great champions of, getting that story out there. But what was most troubling, and I guess kind of led to the impetus, the idea of, the Psychedelic Writers Guild, is that, after publishing that story, I reached out to and, was in contact with a number of, legacy media, mainstream media, outlets here in the greater Boston area, some of, great acclaim, reputationally speaking, and came to find that a lot of these reporters, made this, point earlier about, some of these subjects that were, these, allegations of misconduct that reporters are aware of, that they too, had run-ins with this individual and were very aware of his lack of credibility, and yet continued to quote him, in their coverage leading up to the election, and really platformed, pretty clearly a non-credible source. That perpetuated a lot of misinformation in the run-up to the ballot measure. That while not ultimately the deciding factor in why question 4 didn't pass, yeah, here in November, well, was definitely a factor in shaping the narrative surrounding people within the psychedelic community's perception of the bill, and who was really in charge of grassroots advocacy.
So what
So.
killed Jack?
All right, I'll
Those are the
speed it up.
guilt.
So
Yeah.
yes, I'll speed it up. So the Guild really came from this idea of, both really being an independent media-minded person myself and having carved out a little space here for the politics of the psychedelic renaissance, if you will, but also really wanting to kind of enhance and elevate and amplify both the quality and the scope and depth of coverage, of the psychedelic renaissance, as it's been said, from, as many angles as possible. So kind of building a network, both selfishly, somebody that kind of craves community and am, still fresh into the game, don't have that traditional journalism development pipeline, really would like to be able to establish more of a, a tight-knit community in this space, for networking, source building, community building, collaborative reporting, but also with the goal of building a network of, credible reporters to, to be able to plug and play at larger media outlets at some point and build publication partners.
All
So it's
right.
very much in its early stages. I'll be putting out an interest form that I will share with Jules and everybody else on this panel, to kind of hopefully blast across our networks to, gauge some interest, what
Yeah.
people might want to see from the guild. But yeah, anyways, to wrap it up, much to come. Thank you again, Jules, for, even having me. And I will let you guys get on with the questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Jack. And we wish you good luck with that and look forward to it. Stories from the audience. What are the stories you feel you wish got more coverage that don't? So, what are the stories not being told? One person particularly mentioned ketamine, which is obviously like the by far the biggest legal market here, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. And I personally have felt like I should cover that more. But what else do you feel is not being covered?
I think there's some really specific, like cool stuff going on outside of US and Western Europe, which I'm guilty of, like, focusing mainly on US to be honest. But I was just in New Zealand over the holidays, and there's some really interesting work going on there where they're trying to bring traditional, well, indigenous Maori knowledge and ways of knowing into clinical psilocybin research. So it's a partnership between one of the university hospitals and a group of indigenous Maori people. So like, I haven't seen anything written about that except last week there was something in a New Zealand publication, a paper or something. But I think there's like really interesting projects like that that unfortunately don't usually fall within my beat, which is mainly drug development. But yeah, I think it's a shame that like stories like that aren't getting talked about more because the project's been going on for like 2 years. So yeah, I think more of a like ex-US and ex-Western Europe focus would be cool.
Hmm.
I agree with the ketamine story. Whether or not you think ketamine is a psychedelic, the business market for ketamine is certainly succeeding because it's marketed as a psychedelic, especially in the US with the ketamine clinics. And there's this interesting moment right now where the Brits can correct me. The UK is trying to reschedule ketamine as a more addictive drug, while in the US we have now injectable ketamine. You can get it through telemedicine mailed to your house. And so I think there's a lot of questions about the mechanism of like how it should be delivered. Johnson & Johnson now says that it can be delivered alone without antidepressants. That news came out today, standalone drug. So I think ketamine, since it's being widely used right now, certainly needs a little more attention, again, whether or not you think it's a psychedelic. And something that there is coverage on, but I think will be more important in the coming years is the importance of how the context in which psychedelics is used, it matters. And I mean really more like culturally and even potentially politically. I think the fact that we have a lot of large tech titans and people in right-wing political circles now gravitating towards psychedelics and being a big part of making them mainstream and easy to talk about. I think that matters, and I think it will have implications both in legalization and medicalization, but also just culturally, how psychedelics are experienced and what psychedelic experiences mean. I think they're not just sort of the same every single time you take them. I think people who know that know this. And so I think the cultural side of psychedelic use and mainstreaming is really important. I think, Jules, you write about that very well in terms of the social groups that are forming around these substances, especially here in the US, needs a lot of coverage, again, just kind of examination in some way.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think like yeah, on that thread, I do think that there is a sort of new class of like psychedelic nouveau riche that are being created, whether they own retreat centers in Costa Rica or not. And obviously, you've got people like Sergey Brin that are already independently wealthy, that are getting involved as well. And, I think somewhere along the line, there's obviously economic imperatives to, not disclose issues, right? Whether that's kind of more subtle things or actual abuse or even death. So, yeah, I think as more and more kind of grey market, underground, and legit places open up, I think those questions will be, yeah, really like tantamount to the whole thing. But again, like just like how often do stories get out of like kind of addiction treatment centers when people like fuck up? Like very rarely, I guess. So, you wonder if maybe even like pe people like the advocates of psychedelics will kind of say, oh, but in terms of actually how many things are going wrong, is this proportionate in terms of the coverage? And I think that is, that I think that is a valid point.
Mm.
But in much the same way, you've got these sort of whether it's Western neo shamans or actual indigenous folks, striding around, traveling the world like rock stars in golden robes, and leaving people dazed and destabilized. It's a compelling story, and I think it hasn't probably been told enough. And yeah, I think that could be something coming along the way in 2025, for sure.
Excellent. Another question from the floor. What impact do you see the new Trump administration and the Muskification of the social media world having on coverage of psychedelics, good or bad? Shayla, you've written about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, in some ways it's a little hard to tell because there's often big claims that are made and then the actual impacts are hit or miss. But I think with Elon Musk, we know that he is taking ketamine, a fan of psychedelics. There is this, as I mentioned earlier, overlap between the big tech, sort of libertarian crypto world and an enthusiasm for psychedelics. We don't really know what our social media platforms are going to look like in the coming years. There may be some kind of, not censorship, but certainly algorithmic push for things that already exists now on X, where certain things get amplified and certain things don't. So I think it's a little too soon to say, but I do think that it's important, as always, for journalists to cover the issues that they think are important for consumers to know and for people to know and medical patients to know about. And we'll just kind of see if those things continue to surface on their social feeds. That is connects to the business platform thing where a lot of journalism publications make money based on their performance on social platforms because that's how people see articles. And so it is all kind of tied together in an unsettling way.
Yeah. It is curious how the criticism of Musk and his kind of now enormous kind of influence and power and just constant daily visibility, how the criticism, the pushback against him is often quite tied to his ketamine use, and this kind of sense that, I suppose people are trying to paint a picture of him as, a bit unhinged. I mean, there was footage on X yesterday of him at the inauguration. I don't know if you saw it, kind of rolling his eyes like the Cookie Monster, and of course people say, "Oh, look," So there's been a bit of a shift within Silicon Valley as well, I feel, in the discourse around psychedelics, with people highlighting more, well, there was a very viral tweet about people, in Silicon Valley taking ayahuasca and then having an encounter with a six-dimension Mesopotamian demon and kind of checking out. Anyway, Josh and Amatha, what do you think? Do you think the kind of this tentatively emerging embrace between MAGA and Musk and the psychedelic movement could have an effect on the public perception of psychedelics?
I mean, I
Yeah,
can go
I
quickly.
think.
And, oh, go on,
Sorry, go
Mason.
on, Josh.
Okay. I was going to say on my beat, which is mainly on the drug development front, I think there's some interesting incongruencies, right, between the kind of like RFK Jr. side of things and then, some other members of Trump's cabinet, well, presumed cabinet. So I think, there's this return to kind of like what's natural, right, within the kind of like manosphere and Joe Rogan and RFK Jr. So that to me seems kind of out of kilter with things like synthetic versions of psychedelics, which are obviously going through the drug development pipeline. It works more for things like ibogaine and whole mushrooms. And then again, RFK Jr. is very against, big pharma and patents and, has a lot of rightful concerns about lobbying in the drug approval process, which again, I don't see how that's going to help psychedelic drug development companies. And then even on the kind of like psychedelic policy reform front, Trump's filling out a cabinet of people who are very hawkish, right? And they're saying that they're going to be the law and order party. So again, like I just don't see how that's congruent with the goals of a lot of people in the psychedelic community. So I think personally for me, like that's something that I'm going to be following. In terms of, the more like social media side and, what it means for the public image about psychedelics, I mean, that's not really my wheelhouse, but hopefully, Matha, you're going to have something on that.
Not in your warehouse.
In my
Uh,
Wheelhouse.
wheelhouse.
Wheelhouse, yeah, that is a phrase I never heard before. I heard Roland Griffiths use it at Psychedelic Science, and now I hear it quite often. But I like it. Mather, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or sort of Kamala or Trump, I think that Trump's campaign at least presented itself as disruptive, right? And he has made some potentially quite disruptive appointments, not least Kennedy, right? And psychedelics, even though they do just massage the egos of some people, they certainly, disrupt the minds of others, usually for good. So yeah, it's a really interesting moment, I'd say. I mean, Rick Perry sounds like he might have Trump's ear, and obviously he's like really pushing the Ibogaine stuff now.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean the MDMA thing, I mean, it's not like it was literally like suppressed, like the evidence. The two advanced stage trials, they've got less than 800 people. I mean, I'm sure stuff's been approved for less before, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, perhaps though, a big injection of money from the government to do a sort of rapid sort of study like they did with the COVID vaccine, I guess isn't completely implausible. I mean, I think it's a bit unfair though that Musk continues to get like tarnished for making very reasonable and measured comments about his therapeutic ketamine use. But it's become a bit of a trope. I think there's certainly like some far greater things, to sort of whack him with.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we've got Brad Burge here, who I think we might I know Brad from his communications work, and Brad says, I'd love to know what role, if any, you each see company communications and public relations agencies playing in supporting responsible and effective journalism about psychedelics. How can we make your jobs easier? And do you have any tips for how to communicate with you as journalists? I mean, so there are now emerging, this is part of the professionalization of this as an industry. When I reported on banking at the start of my career, and and PR was a big part of that, the kind of mediation with the media, and it's beginning now. I think even a ketamine marketing association or something. So what role do you think does PR yet have a role, or is it all still like in kind of just informal WhatsApp chats or whatever? Do you think PR and communications agencies have a role to play in this field, and how can they make your jobs easier?
Well, I think PR is definitely playing a role because I get many emails from different PR people all the time about things that are going on in psychedelics. And I'm not talking about Brad, who I have interacted with and who has been a very helpful communications person to me in the past. But generally speaking, I think if you want good journalism about psychedelics and you work in PR comms, you need to understand that we are not PR or comms. Like it's helpful for us to know things that are going on, but we're not working for a company and we're not going to like we don't really or again our position as journalists is that we don't owe the companies anything. We're there to report on a story or as close to the truth as we can find it. And I think that, as you say, the professionalization has been a little rocky at times because there were so many companies that were sort of pay to play, just like republishing press releases, and that's not what journalists do. I mean, I had a case a few years ago where there was a conference I really wanted to go to, and I asked for a press pass, which is something we ask for because we can't pay for every single conference that I want to go to and just listen in on talks. And they said, we'll only give you one if you cover the conference, if you write a nice article about the conference. And I was like, I can't do that. That's quid pro quo. I can't promise you something in exchange for something else. And so they didn't let me come to the conference, which is like, you know, I just don't cover conferences. It's not something I ever do. So that, this was a few years ago, but I also have never been invited back to that conference again, which I think is a shame. And so I think just like understanding what exactly we're doing on the journalism side is important for comms and PR people.
Hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Mather, Josh, you want to add something?
I mean, I don't know if I have much more to add to echo that. I mean, there's a few good folks like Brad who have really got their, fingers on the pulse. But really, I mean, it's a sort of just like kind of cottage industry of people that don't seem to actually know much about psychedelics or the culture or the industry that have sort of hired hands sending out mass emails, and it's quite tedious, frankly. Um, you know, recently I was sort of people reached out to me, and it sounded interesting on the face of it with this one thing, and then it's just like you haven't, without giving too many details, like you're literally just thinking about like getting coverage yourself. You don't know what I report on. You don't know who I am. Do you know what I mean? It's just rude, and it's just like treating people like, as your like sort of emissaries.
Hmm.
So yeah, more people like Brad would be great. I just don't know if there's kind of enough sort of money swilling around, to actually support them, and that's why it ends up just being sort of agency folks, and probably got a ton of a very long to-do list. So not to be too disparaging about them. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, so Tally says, personally, I think we need more investigative pieces about people guilty of misconduct within the field. It's something we've touched on a bit. I mean, those stories are, they're very hard to do. I don't know if I mean I've done some of them sometimes, and they're very and just as a Substack, and they're stressful. They lead to a lot of pushback. there's legal risk. But they are, arguably they have a role as well. Do you think that, do we need more of them, or are they just like, oh, it's just another scandal, big, kind of, maybe they don't necessarily help the field move forward? What do you think about those kinds of stories?
I think they're really important. I think that whenever there's a case of misconduct, there's usually some example there to learn for what exactly went wrong and who was harmed and how they were harmed. And I'll just echo that it's very hard. I mean, it takes a lot of resources. This was many years ago, but when Mind Bloom first started, a lot of people were reaching out to me saying that they had been sent incorrect doses, or they didn't feel the therapeutic support was
Hmm.
enough. And this was long before the injections were available by mail. And we did a piece at Vice where I interviewed, dozens of people to make sure that it was not a one-off case, and you're making claims about the kind of support that's available or not available. The fact checking is really, really intense. I mean, it took like months to put the story together. And then, you don't even know if you're really going to have an impact. Of course, then you always get a lot of pushback, and somebody else had a different experience and they pushed back. So, but I still think it's very important, and it doesn't mean that's the only thing that we focus on. Like, we're completely capable of writing lots and lots of different kinds of articles, and I think that the misconduct article should absolutely not go away. It just does take a lot more time and care.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think your stories on the like invention of bee shamanism and the whole cult over there and the Roger Bardalis story in Pacalpa are really, really important contributions
Mm.
to this canon, that really is probably underpopulated, right? Like I was saying about this Ibogaine clinic story that got spiked after the legal threat. You hear stories about people taking out lawsuits just against folks for bloody putting negative reviews about them, like online. And I think there is a kind of big space, a yawning gap for like some sort of psychedelic watchdog organization to have this kind of TripAdvisor light sort of
Yeah.
thing out there with a directory. So the real bad players don't have to wait to get exposed by you or the very rare occasion really in the mainstream media that something also gets exposed, right?
Yeah, I
Right.
totally agree. Like the bee shamanism story is a great example of like it is about one case, but it has more value than just the one incident, right? It is about like how these things happen, which is the bigger importance of the misconduct stories is exposing exactly what happened, but also how did this happen and where can these sort of factors align to happen elsewhere down the line.
I think what one peculiarity about the psychedelic space is there's a lack of any kind of trade associations yet or complaints procedures. If you're a licensed therapist, you might lose your license or get stripped temporarily, like Ben Sessa. But on the whole, this is mainly the underground. So, you can, if something happens, you don't have many options for recourse. Sometimes these things get dealt with within the community. I've heard about that, like internal mediation, and maybe that can sometimes work, but often it doesn't. And so people go to journalists. So we're in this pre-legal framework, and kind of going to journalists or going to the media or going public, or that could be on Reddit or on Instagram or something like that, is one of the options. So it's almost it's the sign of the immaturity of the field. So I think you have journalists who take on these stories for a bit until it's too toxic, and then they leave and pass it on to someone else who does it for a while.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole thing about like Flack and like Chomsky's propaganda model, right?
Mm.
Like that's how, the mainstream media at least ends up basically supporting the status quo on the whole, right? Because there's just so many like kind of interests, basically protecting them. And, obviously like with the Bee Shaman and Roger Bardalis, they're more kind of like fringe actors. But then when you get up towards, the food chain, not necessarily in the psychedelic space, but just as a more general point,
Like
they're
Pfizer
they're just so
or like
protected. They're lawyered up, and we're just people in our like individual silos. Maybe a staffer, maybe not, and it's a David and Goliath fight, really.
That's interesting. Yeah, as it becomes more professionalized and big money, in some ways it might also become harder to report on stuff. Yeah, okay. Well, we're coming to the end. There's some more questions. Uh, so what are, well, here's an important one. Just in terms of kind of politics and campaigns and voters, maybe we can end on this. What solutions are there to getting accurate psychedelic information out to constituents who may have to vote on policy but know nothing about it? Is traditional media coverage necessary? Necessary? How can we bring psychedelics outside this bubble, especially as local media is disappearing? And we could also bring in Jack here as well, because, Jack reported a lot for the Massachusetts bill, if Jack's still here. But I mean, yes, so people are voting on these things, and parliaments are trying to decide how to legalize psychedelics. So what are the challenges about accurate reporting on some of these kinds of political measures for voters who are outside the bubble? And trying to make sense about, okay, what are these substances? How should we vote on them? How hard is that, do you think? I mean, Jack, what do you think?
Yeah, it was a really interesting line to walk, there were, especially, having reported some things that didn't make it into kind of the legacy media local coverage that a lot of your like lesser informed voters about the general, nature of psychedelics and some of the intricacies of like is ibogaine something you could home grow in Massachusetts because there was a home grow component to, like no, of course not. But I saw obviously like the prohibitionist arm of the kind of the opposition twist that into ways where they were just spitting nonsense, but that really jumped off the page and they ran a really effective strategy. But also, one of the things that was really interesting is when I first uncovered, a story that I mentioned about, someone impersonating a veteran. I encourage folks to go track down and read. I got a call from somebody connected to Dewey Square Group, the consultant, firm that was kind of running the show for the Question 4 campaign with an $8 million nearly $8 million war chest. Um, and they, and in so many words, kind of encouraged me not to go to an outlet like the Globe with such a story, both out of, fear of, like we've talked about, there's folks who are worried that exposing, the very worst of this could just do broader damage to the movement. But, so there was obviously a spin that was given to, both their narrative for the campaign, but also, actively dissuading, spreading the story that, I uncovered again. It was like the worst kept secret in, advocacy up here. And I think part of that was, this grass tops consulting firm wanting to control the narrative in any way that they could. And I've seen also some of the difficulties, and I'm working on a couple of projects, and I'll wrap up my answer here. But I'm working on a couple of projects about, how the narrative that has been put out by some of, those folks affiliated with the campaign and some of the power players behind it, both privately and publicly, about, why voters voted against question 4 in the resounding nature that they did, and, who exactly they blame is a very misleading narrative based on the actual numbers and also based on, a very resurgent interest from the legislature. Last Friday, 12 different, psychedelic related bills were filed in Massachusetts State House, which is a record that was previously set by Massachusetts, which was 7 mostly. Anyways, so the intricacies of this media coverage is really trying to again walk that line between you know critical coverage of grassroots misconduct that might also have political implications, in terms of broader perception of the movement, while also navigating the tricky boundary of if I burn, this or that, broader power player, one too many times, they'll never speak to me again. So, uh, yeah, I mean, it's definitely complicated. I think that there's been a lot of, sub threads that have been lost in the wash from some parachute reporting from legacy media outlets. The number of reporters I spoke to who like didn't know that these grassroots advocates had been brought on by the campaign, that that just got all these bills filed, single-handedly, no budget, just outreach, is astonishing weeks after the election. So,
Okay.
yeah, no, it's really difficult. Anyways, sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
there was this guy in Detroit. He was like a local businessman slash fraudster. I've got a story coming on him, and he literally renamed himself Shaman Shu overnight.
Yeah.
Convicted mortgage fraudster, and everyone took him seriously. I mean, he was even claiming that he personally wrote Proposal E in Detroit, and the reporters covered it. I mean, everyone's just so time stretched, but I think people have just forgotten kind of any sort of fact checking or looking slightly beneath the surface.
Mm. Well, we've got some big, national organizations being set up, like the National Psychedelic Policy Institute or something. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting what role they'll play. Um, yeah, okay. Thank you very much to everybody to our panelists, our special guests, to all everyone who's attended. Any kind of last thoughts, in terms of maybe kind of one sentence, what you think is going to happen this year? What might be a big story to kind of follow this year? One sentence, Jack.
I think the evolution of the grassroots movement, the political arm of the psychedelic renaissance, will be remembered as one of the most consequential, socio-political movements of the 21st century.
All right, Shayla.
I think that psychedelics will continue to become mainstream with positive, negative, and surprising unknown as of now effects.
Okay, continuing mainstreaming. Josh.
I'm terrible at this sort of thing. I usually write 10,000 word articles. But I think it's going to be equal parts chaos, some of which positive, and equal parts damp squibs and disappointments.
Okay. Chaos and damp squibs. And Mather.
Yeah, I mean, I think that more and more people are going to continue to take psychedelics, right? But yeah, more and more people are going to have bad trips, and they're going to tell their friends.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe a kind of general public growing sense of, the benefits, but also the risks as well. You wonder
Yeah.
if things might finally happen at the federal level. Something or other has surely got to get passed at the federal level, even if it's just like one special test site for veterans or something. But you'd hope to see some kind of progress there. All right. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. Everyone who's attended will also get sent a recording of it as well. And yeah, thank you. See you next time. Thank you very much to our panelists, to Mather, Josh, Shayla, and Jack. Very much.
Thanks, Jules. Thanks,
Jules.
Thanks,
everyone.
Bruce.
Thank
Thanks
you,
all.
Jules.
Have a good evening.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.